Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cyber Dandy Show. Today we have on Adar Weinreb. He is the founder and manager, or whatever the position would be, of the Sulha channel and organization, and has done a lot of debate stuff online. There's a episode on that has Noam Chomsky on it, with Rudy, Rochman, or Rochman, or however it's pronounced. There's all sorts of people that he's talked to that are in the debate scene and covering Israel-Palestine and things like that. And he's got several other projects he does as well. So Adar, I wanted you to talk a little bit about that as we open up, let the audience get to know you a little bit.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on. It's great to be here. I'm an Israeli American. I lived half my life in Israel, half my life in the US. I served 3 years in the IDF. When I was in the IDF, I did not see things the way I do today. I was raised with deep Zionist teachings. I was never taught to hate Palestinians, but I was taught that we need to protect ourselves against them. And if we don't, they will kill us. That was the extent to which I understood the conflict. Interestingly, it was my time in the IDF where I began to see things differently. And not because I noticed something that bothered me. I was call it brainwashed, too much a part of the system to recognize why the current status quo, why our military presence in the West Bank is problematic. That I did not recognize at all. But I had a moment where I was guarding on base, and we get bored. So Israeli soldiers are primarily 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. I was bored out of my mind. I'm looking at a poster on the wall, and this poster showed different Hamas training techniques. And there was a picture of a Hamas soldier crawling through sand. And I'd been crawling that same day. And I looked at this Hamas soldier, and I saw myself in him. I started asking myself, I said, wait, if I was born in Gaza, would that be me? Does his family view him as a hero and me as a terrorist? Is that possible? Now, this didn't change my view overnight, but it certainly planted a seed. And that seed over time grew into, call it a beautiful garden that recognizes the humanity of the other side. And I recognize that really the biggest difference between me and my sworn enemy is really the side of an imaginary line we were born on. It didn't change my view overnight, but about 3 years after getting released from the IDF, during the 2014 Gaza Operation in Gaza, that's when I started getting involved. I saw two very distinct narratives: Gaza under attack, Israel under attack. Nobody was saying Israel and Gaza under attack. Nobody was trying to show how the people on both sides suffer from this conflict. So I started talking about it primarily through Facebook statuses, and that kind of set me off on this path to trying to humanize the other side. And that has been the primary work I've done in the activism space, the humanization of the other. So a few years ago, I launched a YouTube channel called Sulha, which means to reconcile in Arabic. And the premise is simple: live stream conversations between Israelis and Palestinians and all sorts of people from opposing viewpoints. The primary focus is Israel-Palestine, but I've had some anti-Semites on. We touch on other geopolitical issues as well. And more recently, I understood very quickly the power of these conversations because I get feedback all the time. People on both sides telling me their worldview has transformed just from consuming this content. The problem with that type of content is it's so hard to scale because people with opposing viewpoints don't often find common ground if there's not a facilitator helping them find common ground. Now, facilitation is very limited. It's not scalable. Well, now with developments in AI, we believe we found a way to scale civil discourse. So recently, me and a good friend launched a company called headon.ai, which is essentially a platform designed to bring people from opposing viewpoints together for conversations. These conversations will be guided by an AI facilitator. The facilitator will be trained to help people speak longer, understand each other better, and ultimately find common ground. So we're very excited to take our learnings from the past years of facilitating these conversations and essentially automating it and scaling it to millions of people around the world. Now, this is no novel task. There's no guarantee. for success. But as all entrepreneurs, I'm delusional enough to believe strongly that we will succeed. But yet I'm realistic to know that there's no guarantee.
All right. Well, that's going to be a really interesting project. I'm curious to see how that turns out. As far as your background, I mean, I come from a fairly different background myself, within the history or the possibilities for someone who's also Jewish. Definitely more from like a non-political Jewish family, not Zionist. My parents used to threaten me that if I was bad, I was either going to have to work on a kibbutz or I would have to join the U.S. military or go to military school or something. Refused to go on my birthright trip because of the Palestinian issue, and have not had an opportunity to go since. So pretty detached from the experiences of what it's like to be there. And the reason I'm saying all this is just because my audience really probably doesn't know a whole lot about me. So just throwing that in there a little as well.
Well, so just to build on how different our background is, I mentioned serving the IDF, but what I didn't mention is I moved to Israel when I was 18 in order to serve in the IDF. It was put in my head from a young age by my father. I'm considered 10th generation Israeli. My family moved to Ottoman Palestine in 1812. So I was raised with these deep Zionist teachings. And from a very young age, it was pretty clear that I turned 18, I'm going to do what any good Zionist does, go serve his country.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, my family's been in America since mid 1800s, at least, like definitely before a lot of the major events that led to migrations to Israel and things like that. Very old family here. So coming from that and winding up where you are, I think is a little more surprising than where I wound up, which is being an anarchist and kind of taking the lessons of the way I saw the history of the diaspora, persecution, things like that, and kind of blaming the state itself as one of the reasons these things happen. But the way that ties in today is I wanted to have you talk about, eventually some of the different solutions on the table to the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and focusing more on some of the things that people might not be familiar with. We talk about a little the one-state solution and different models for that, but also what are being called federal solutions, which I'll let you make some of those distinctions later. But before we get into that, I kind of wanted to just go over like what the problem is with the nation-state model, especially when it comes to the history of Jewish migration, settlement, and everything else in Palestine, and how that developed according to this sort of ideal of creating nation states. So I'll let you give your views on that. It's a lot of history. I don't know the best way to put it, so I'll let you take the lead there.
The importance of the nation state model specifically, or how we ended up with this model?
I think both things are important to cover because it's not, Zionism didn't necessarily begin with the goal of creating a specifically Jewish nation state. And that became ultimately the goal. But that wasn't until around 1942. And then it also came with its own kinds of problems.
Right. So I guess the way I view it is the nation state was an evolution of a system of governance from the empire to the nation. Right. It was this idea that why should we be ruled by an empire where they can't really address the needs of the people? We're a distinct group. Let us have our own nation. This is a trend we began to see in the 1800s. And I think this is a trend that inspired both Zionism as well as Palestinian nationalism. There were different brands of Zionism. Some were attempting to achieve a nation state. Others just wanted what they described as a homeland. There's at least a dozen different variations of Zionism in the early days. but certainly some were inspired by this growing trend of nation states. It seems that Palestinians too were inspired by this, right? They saw the Ottoman Empire weakening. They saw nation states popping up all over the world. They saw an opportunity to finally have a Palestinian state, some wanted an independent Palestinian state. Others wanted to be part of Greater Syria, but in its state and not be under the Ottoman Empire. This coincided with Zionism attempting to build a nation state on that same piece of land. So now we have a situation where a nation state, I view it as a better model than the empire to protect the rights of the people. But we now have a situation where you have two distinct populations who have completely different ideas for self-determination, attempting to build a nation state on the same piece of land. And this, to me, is the essence of the conflict from day one.
Okay, so yeah, that's a little bit how I see it too. There's some minor differences, not in the big picture of nation states, forming as a solution to the problems of empire, but more on the way that the nation state model was favored by the League of Nations and the British Mandate, as like their mandate was based around trying to create specifically nationalist states and not like a civic state like the United States or something along the lines of just being like equal rights for everybody, everything's mixed. So position on what self-determination can look like that came out of a kind of a zero-sum game that the League of Nations created for competing groups in the post-Ottoman Middle East, even outside of Israel. So one of the first things that started happening even before like the state of Israel was created is that, the Zionists and the Arab nationalists and later Palestinian nationalists wanted to started fighting with each other and having really big conflicts all throughout the 20s and 30s, resulted in some massacres. And the mandate powers started looking at this and saying, I don't think these two people can ever exist together and rule together. And so they started recommending, that the land is partitioned, which is a similar thing that they did in India and did in other places as well. And it had pretty catastrophic consequences. So the thing is, though, is that they also recommended a secondary plan in 1947, which would have been a civic single binational state. It was called the Minority Plan. And it had the backing of India and it had the backing of Yugoslavia. But that's about it. Everyone else thought partition was the thing that needed to happen. So anyway, long story short, like the difference between the way I see that is that we could have had something much different, but the violent nature of the circumstances really made people feel like each group needed its own ethno-nationalist state. And correct. Yeah, so what I want to focus on, I actually I know right now you're like in this process of digging through all the data on the death tolls and everything in Gaza and shoring up all the false claims that are being made. And I just don't have good insight into that kind of thing. I try to stay away from current events and current conflicts because I just find them extremely difficult to get good information on. So more on the like theoretical and historical side, I wanted to talk to you about like what some of these solutions look like, especially because I've seen on your show that you've spoken in depth about this with a number of people.
Yeah, sure. So, to your point about not wanting a binational state in 47, that's very true. And this is after decades of violence between Jews and Palestinians living on the land. Is it possible that had early Zionists came and attempted to build a binational state from day one, that it could have been achieved? I think that's certainly possible, but not after decades of violence. There was just too much animosity. We needed the separation. Now, Palestinians are often blamed for rejecting that, and I personally wish they would have accepted it. Their lives would have been better. Our lives would have been better. But I don't blame them for not accepting it. No population before them has ever accepted a foreign population coming and taking part of their land. The rejection is a very natural human reaction to people taking your land. And despite, Jewish claim to indigeneity on the land, and I believe that indigeneity has this broad definition. So I actually view both Jews and Palestinians as indigenous to the land. But this isn't a consideration that would make any meaningful difference in Palestinian rejectionism. In their mind, they didn't recognize us to be indigenous. We were Europeans. We dressed as Europeans. We spoke as Europeans. We didn't act like Middle Easterners. So that, as far as they're concerned, they rejected colonization, which every colonized group before them did. So I don't blame them. Now, in terms of solutions, we often hear two-state solutions. This is like the establishment solution that most of the Western world likes to talk about. That seems to be like pretty straightforward. One state for the Jews, one state for the Palestinians, will be neighbors, right? The reason why this has not been achieved yet is, I think, for that same reason. It's very hard to convince a population that got their land taken to just agree that it's okay that their land will get taken. It's not a realistic thing to expect. And had Israel approached the past 75 years differently, then perhaps we could have gotten to a place of two-state solution. But if we really look at Israel's policy, it's not hard to understand why Palestinians have continuously land. So they attacked us. Our response was, you know what, we'll just take more of your land. Then in 1967, we saw an imminent threat from Jordan and a few other neighboring countries. So we took the entire West Bank, which we could justify for security reasons. But what's the justification for giving an economic incentive for our citizens to move into the West Bank? So our approach has been expand when opportunity is given. And there have been examples of us returning land. But in terms of West Bank, and from 48, we have just continuously expanded outward. So we're trying to convince a people that have immense amount of dignity to come to terms with our existence when we can, that has caused them to hate us in the first place. That's clearly not a recipe to get them to accept us. Now, when we look at the current layout of the demographics, most Palestinians don't support two states. They want access to all of the land. And today, I'd say it's a little under 50% of Jewish Israelis support two states, so the majority on the Israeli side doesn't either. And on both sides, those who want to keep the land whole are more ideologically driven than those who want to divide the land. So the energy of the people on both sides want to keep the land whole. So to change their minds and to convince them that two states is the best solution is possible, but it seems like a great uphill battle. Not to mention, it's unclear what a two-state solution will look like, or what a Palestinian state will look like given settlement expansion, right? Will it look like Swiss cheese? Will we have to uproot 150,000 Jews from their homes, which there's zero political will to do so in Israeli society? So there's many challenges with the two-state solution. An alternative we hear of is one-state solution, and this is becoming increasingly popular. This kind of speaks to the ideal of many Westerners: one secular democratic state for all people. We're all equal under the law. This is a beautiful ideal that I on one hand support, but in practice, I don't see it working out that way, because two populations that are roughly 50% each, who have been in conflict for 100 years with deep levels of fear, hate, and mistrust of one another, instantly living under one government, competing for political and demographic control, in my opinion, is likely to result in disaster. So there's new and creative solutions popping up. One is, call it a more sophisticated version of two states. The other is a more sophisticated version of one state. It comes in the form of confederation and federation. A confederation is similar to the European Union, where you have independent nation states, but they have open borders and a level of cooperation, economic, political, security cooperation. This is a confederation solution, which I think solves many of the problems that the traditional two states doesn't. And then the federation solution is more similar to the United States or Switzerland, where it's a one-state solution, but you split it up into smaller states or cantons. You have a much higher level of local autonomy, where you don't have distinct ethnic groups competing over control. They have local autonomy, and then you have a constitution and a system of checks and balances ensuring the rights of all people on the land. So I think that the most feasible and likely solutions today are either in the form of confederation or federation. And unfortunately, there's not nearly enough conversation about it. We just hear two states, one states. And again, both confederation and federation fall under the category of two and one states. But because people aren't kind of getting into the detail, it's often outright rejected by people living on the land. Israelis hear one state, they're like, no way. Palestinians hear two states, they're like, no way. Right? So there's this outright rejection of the current proposals because we're not getting into the details. The details help us feel more comfortable with these solutions.
Okay. So sorry, the video was lagging a bit and you were just catching up there at the end. But I think that's a good. So what's interesting to me about this coming around is that these ideas are very similar to anarchist proposals of how political systems should work, basically, which, also, anarchism did have an influence on some of the early Zionists, like Hashem or Hatzer, however that's pronounced. I don't have any Hebrew language skill. But
the young guardians is the translation.
Yeah.
Or the young guard.
Yeah, and they were really like the most far left part of the left labor Zionists, which is a whole bunch of divisions, complexity there. But it's interesting that anarchism does not get a respectable treatment anymore, even though it used to have a lot of respect, back then. Yet we're seeing that this sort of decentralization of power is coming a little bit more into vogue and then taking the form of being sort of a more respectable solution in the case of the federal and confederal models that you're talking about. And so I just find it really interesting to see this happening. And I think, I'm not an anarchist just because I'm like opposed to authority. I also have a very practical view on it, having a really good understanding of ethnic conflicts and how to resolve the issue of power between ethnic groups. So that's sort of why I'm interested in this. And you did tell me a little bit about the guest you had on who was proposing the federal solution and kind of like what their angle on it was.
Yeah, sure.
Anything else
about anarchism first, because I think they may help this conversation. So I guess my the reason why I'm not confident in an anarchist solution, at least from the reading I've done, anarchism would remove a monopoly of violence, which in theory sounds good. But if there's no monopoly on violence, then those who hold the most power can then create a new monopoly on violence. If we create an anarchist situation on the land, Jews being much better funded can then just create their own new monopoly on violence. And who can stop that from happening?
So there's a lot of versions of anarchism, especially when it comes to the ideal situation. But specifically on that question, the real difference between the federal idea the way that most people think of it from like the history of the United States or Switzerland or whatever we're talking about, is that the monopoly on violence is kind of from the top down. Whereas in an anarchist solution, you still do have the opportunity to centralize violence or the like use of force into some sort of constitutional body, but it would be from the bottom up. And so what you would do in that situation is like the way that people, like labor unions used to send delegates to the first international congresses or something like that. You would send your delegates to serve within that more centralized organization, but they would only have the mandate that you give them. Whereas when it's the other way around, you really have like, you have power at the local level being appointed by the federal government, or you have a lot of like coercive oversight, where you could, for instance, force one of the cantons or force one of the states to pay taxes. And so it's basically a difference between how voluntary the configuration is. And so the argument for the anarchist one is it's more democratic, basically, is what it comes down to.
Right. Okay. You asked me about the guest I had on. So his name's Emanuel Shahaf, which interestingly, I mentioned headon.ai, the platform we're building. So we actually have a Discord community where we're doing over a dozen conversations a week. And just an hour before you and I started talking, I interviewed Emanuel on the Discord. So the Federation is very fresh in my mind now. So it's great timing. Emanuel is one of the architects of the Federation solution, and there are many variations of it. Emanuel seems to be one of the most pragmatic in terms of how you get Israelis to agree to it, right? He sees Israel as holding the power. He cares less about getting full Palestinian consensus. He cares about getting full Israeli consensus, or enough consensus that we can actually act on it, because we're the ones with the power to act. So his version of the Federation is 30 different cantons from the river to the sea, but he excludes Gaza. The reason he excludes Gaza is because if we include Gaza, the land is 50-50, and he believes to currently include Gaza in the Federation. So his first version of Federation includes all the land from the river to the sea, aside from Gaza, which that gives Jews a 2/3 demographic majority. And he believes that is much more pragmatic and feasible. And I actually tend to agree with him. I think the most just federation includes Gaza, but let's start with what we could get. So he wants to start with that as phase one. Once we could show it's stable and working, then we could find a way to bring Gaza into the Federation. So that's his plan. Under his current plan, he says there would be 20 Jewish cantons, 10 Palestinian cantons. Now, there's going to be mixed populations in some of these. That's the majority. The majority will be Jewish in 20 of them. The majority will be Palestinian in 10. The way the federal government will work will be similar to the United States. There won't be electoral college. It'll be popular vote, but you will have 3 branches of government: the executive branch, which will be president chosen based on popular vote. Each canton will send 2 senators to be in the Senate, and then Congress will be dependent on proportion of population size. So that's his current plan, and he really seems to have been thoughtful in how to actually achieve this. Right? I think often activists get stuck in some ideal worldview they would like to achieve, and I think it's good to have an idealist vision to work towards. But we also need to ground ourselves in pragmatism if we want to make any progress.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot, because when I, look at the surveys, which and opinion polls are that, you can only give them so much weight, but they basically show that on both within the Palestinian population and the Israeli population, support for the one state is like 10%. Maybe at some points 20%. I think the highest it has ever been was like 30 something. And just moving people away from the idea of having this sort of autonomy and into this sort of like vague one state idea where it's not clear if anyone really is able to preserve their identity and what's important to them and make collective decisions is, I think it's an impossible task. I mean, the reason the two-state was so popular is because at least that's a situation where no one's giving up their identity. But in the sort of like Marxist single state idea where you have to basically give up on collective self-determination and everyone's treated as an individual, you're really violating a lot of the whole, like the foundations of why people are even there to begin with. So yeah, that's, the logic of it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, some of the things I don't understand. So why exactly is 30 the number that he's come up with for the amount of states? Is that just where the cities are now? There's 30 of them, or?
I'm not sure exactly how he reached that number, but I imagine he looked at the demographic layout of the land and saw how the different ethnic groups are grouped in different areas, and based on that kind of drew the lines based on what he thought would make the most sense, separating between different ethnic groups as to not compete over what the nature of that canton would look like.
Yeah. Let's see. And then, as far as the thing about Gaza and the demographics, one thing I've never totally understood is this argument about why the population size matters if you're proposing something like a constitution that you can't change and that guarantees certain rights to each group. So, like, is this just people don't believe it?
I think there's probably two things at play. One, you could say that it's an irrational fear, just the thought of 50-50. It doesn't make you feel like you're so secure. And, Jews have a very good reason to not feel secure as minorities, right? Now, I wouldn't say that our attempt to be a majority, so far we succeeded, but it hasn't been a true success, because today, out of all the countries where there's a large Jewish population, none are more dangerous for Jews than Israel. And currently the existence of Israel makes lives for Jews around the world more dangerous as well. So it hasn't been we succeeded in establishing a state despite all odds, but it hasn't been a true success story, not yet at least. But I think there's also, I think it's not just from irrational fear. I think that Constitution technically could be changed or overthrown if you have enough people that are fighting for it. So I think that there's a greater risk that happens if you're 50-50. So if we start with 2/3, 1/3, see that it works, see that it's stable, it'll be much easier to convince Israelis to come to terms with Gaza joining. Because even now, even this proposition of a federation is not going to be easy for many Israelis to agree to. It's going to be very unpopular amongst a large amount of the population. So we need to make it as easy as possible if we have any hope of achieving this.
Yeah, from that makes a little more sense. I mean, I don't want to quibble too much about it because we're just so far away from like seeing that kind of progress that it's a very minor detail. But so another thing I wanted to talk about in all this is the usefulness of the settler colonial framework for understanding the situation. And I say it that way because I think there is some use for it. And I think there is some applicability. But I also say it that way because I think that use has some pretty significant limitations that get in the way of trying to find solutions. So I was wondering, like, what your opinion is of just reading the history through that lens, and whatever else you would like to say about it.
Yeah, sure. So a few years ago, I had an interview with an Israeli professor by the name of Arnon Degani, and he makes the claim that Israel did certainly engage in settler colonialism, which is not the same as colonialism. The difference between colonialism is people being sent by a mother nation to extract resources and send it back to that nation. Settler colonialism is more coming and replacing an existing population. And Zionism, in practice, whether in theory, there's many variations of Zionism, in practice, Zionism was settler colonialism. The challenge with that framework is that I think it gives Palestinians a false hope of what's possible, right? Because you could look at many examples where if you're just violent enough towards colonizers, eventually the cost of the colony will be so great that they leave. We saw this in Algeria with the French. We saw this in India with the British. So many Palestinians in their mind, they're inspired. They say, maybe they're not inspired by the British model because that was a brilliant, beautiful, nonviolent one, but they're certainly inspired by that Algeria one, which was like, let's just be violent enough towards the colonizers and leave. The problem is that we Jews don't view ourselves as colonizers. We view us as an indigenous population that returned, and we would ethnically cleanse every last Palestinian before we ourselves will leave, right? So that's the stance most Jews have. So on one hand, it is there's certainly inaccuracy to that framework, but it's limited to really understanding the complexity of the conflict. And I think it does give Palestinians a false idea of what tactics are going to be effective.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. I think the problem I see with it is somewhat similar, that it's sort of like if you put all of everything that's wrong with the situation into the bucket that it's settler colonialism, you're almost implying that if you get rid of the settler colonialists, you're solving the problem. And for me, that implication, one, I think it's anti-Semitic. If you take it to the extent that all the Jews there are settler colonial, there's other ways you could use that framework and say, no, it's only since 48 or only since 67 or so on and so forth. But I think there's definitely a way that it implies a foreignness that is inappropriate. But the other thing is that it's practically inadequation because, as you've said, no one's going anywhere. And if you keep trying to see everything through that lens, you're basically trying to accomplish something impossible. And I guess there is a third thing. I also think that framework has an impact on diaspora Jews like myself, where I think it allows anti-Zionists to carry water for Arab nationalists or Palestinian nationalists without realizing it. And yes, there is a lot of truth to it. However, there's a lot of truth to saying there were already Jews there. There was, they had their own society before Zionism. It was distinct, it was interdependent, but distinct. And when the Jews started migrating in, a lot of them were going to Jewish areas. It's not like, this expectation to assimilate into Arab society that kind of comes along with anti-Zionism, I think is also contributes to an idea of what a diaspora Jew is in some ways that I feel is also anti-Semitic. And I don't know if other people make that connection, but, I'm deeply involved in left-leaning circles, and the sort of rhetoric I see that launches off from that framework quickly becomes anti-Semitic when it starts looking at, indigeneity or foreignness or Jewish identity. It just totally crosses some lines for me.
Right. Well, many still believe that, believe in the Khazar theory, for example, that there's zero connection between Ashkenazi Jews and the land that they live on. And, you look at me, like I'm 99.8% Ashkenazi. I don't look like a traditional Middle Easterner, but I don't look European as well. Clearly there's some distinct ethnic group that we have. And if you look at my DNA and you trace Ashkenazi DNA, my DNA is 30 to 50% Levantine, right? And that's
Right.
this was our ability to preserve our Middle Eastern DNA for thousands of years is quite impressive. It really speaks to the insular nature of Jews in the diaspora. But even after thousands of years, we still trace 30 to 50% of our DNA back to the Middle East. So we are clearly a population that came from there, but we don't get that recognition. And what's interesting is, and this kind of speaks to call it left-wing anti-Semitism, which a lot of it is just grounded in power, right? Jews are powerful, so we don't receive the sympathy of a traditional, historically oppressed group. But
Sure.
if we were to give an example of Native Americans that were displaced, and maybe that's not far enough, but even let's say Native Americans were brought to England hundreds of years ago, and hundreds of years they adopted some British culture, but they always kept some Native American identity. There would be sympathy from many leftists that they should have the right to self-determination on their ancestral homeland. We would have sympathy for them. But because Jews are the powerful ones, it's much harder to have sympathy. And I do want to make clear, even if you can say that indigenous people have a right to return to the land they come from, that doesn't justify displacing an existing population. That doesn't justify building an ethno-state where 20% of the population of that state are not of that ethnic group. So we could recognize indigenous rights, yet that doesn't mean that anything an indigenous group does is therefore okay or justified.
Yeah, and I think that's some of these points are a little hard for a lot of people to focus on. And I don't want to say that they rely on a simplistic narrative, but there is a lot of complexity to these questions that unless you are from a identity group that sort of has this conception of itself, it's going to be really hard for you to understand. Like the idea of being a Jew doesn't really fit into modern categories the way that as far as religion or race or ethnicity or nationality, all of these are like modern concepts that were developed and later then kind of retroactively applied to Jews. Whereas, the Am Yisrael or this whole thing that pre-exists it doesn't fit neatly into any of them. But so you get people that I think become over-reliant on modern categories, and then they try to apply those categories to situations that are inappropriate. And it's especially bad when it's colorism, because that is like colorism exists in really unique ways in different places in the world. But if you're coming out of like the BLM movement here in America, and you're used to being able to use color divisions as like an appropriate category for understanding power, when you're looking at Israel, it doesn't map on so neatly. Okay, so all that said, like that's a limitation, just in the way that the problem's conceptualized, but the kind of solutions that you're going to get if that's the framework you use, they're basically zero-sum games where one of the populations is the true indigenous one, and they should have a nation state that is serving their self-determination and not the other group's self-determination. Or you think the problem is that you need to get rid of the identity having any power at all and get that kind of one civic state where everyone's an individual equally. And yes, I think that's going to have to change, right? Like that group identity is that middle ground with the federal solution, whether or not it's from an anarchist bottom up or a more American or whatever top down style, has to recognize the rights of groups.
Correct. The case could be made that if individual rights are strong enough and protected enough, then you don't need collective rights. Individual rights are more important. If every individual is protected, then the collective by default is protected. That is, unless the collective has a desire to self-determine in a way that is not included with these individual rights. So, for example, some amount of Jews want a Jewish state because they want a Jewish state. They want a state that is Jewish. They whether it's a theocratic state or it just has a Jewish nature, that's something that some amount of Jews would like. So I don't see how that is protected in individual rights. But in terms of protecting the safety of Jews, which is the primary motivation of most Jews to have this ethno-state, it's not a religious component, it's a security component, right? Because 50% of Jewish Israelis are religious, the other 50% are secular, many of whom are atheists. The thing that connects all of them is the understanding that we cannot live on the land currently without the state protecting us, and we don't trust being a minority, right? So that is the connecting desire of virtually all Jews living on the land. That can actually be solved through individual rights. But, as I mentioned, there are some level of collective rights that some amount of Jews, it is important to them that I don't see them giving up on. So I think a federation can actually do both, though, right? It allows you to have, there's a Jewish essence to the state, there's a Muslim essence to the state, more so in each canton, let local groups self-determine as they wish, and have some kind of overarching system, that protects the people living on the land. I could say working. When it's one of the most complicated conflicts in history, it's going to require likely a sophisticated solution. And even a very sophisticated solution, there's no guarantee for success, but we need to get the ball rolling. Maintaining this unsustainable and immoral status quo for eternity will always result in more violence. Doesn't matter how strong we feel we are. It doesn't matter how much security we have. Palestinians are not going to give up on their rights. They're not just going to forget about it. And if we don't give them a nonviolent means to achieve their rights, that will lead to violence. And we've seen this consistently. And unfortunately, we currently do not have a political will in Israel to change the status quo in any meaningful way. And that's where October 7th came from. Which, again, I'm not justifying October 7th. I'm anti-violence. I'm not justifying it, but I'm understanding and explaining it. It is the natural result of a group of people who do not have rights and do not have nonviolent means to achieve those rights. And let me just add one caveat. I think there are nonviolent means to achieve them, but there's so not clear-cut. There's no clear path for Palestinians to achieve their rights. Not through violence, not through peace, but generally, when you don't give people a clear nonviolent means, violence is the result.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of people get bogged down in like this debate about whether or not Palestinians have other ways to try to achieve their rights, and I think like at the end of the day, they're not getting their rights either way. The violence isn't working, the nonviolence isn't working, and so like. I don't know if we have to really try so hard to defend either of those things. And like, I don't know. It seems a little bit like trying to find what, like, when people bring it up, I think a lot of it is they're trying to like demonize the Palestinians for their violence or whatever. I just am not sympathetic to.
Which is wrong. It's tricky, right? It's like we don't want to justify violence, as many do. Many say, yeah, this is okay, this is justified. On both sides, they say, some will say October 7th was legitimate resistance, and many will say that what Israel did in response was legitimate self-defense. I would say that both Palestinians have a right to resistance. Israel, there's many ways in which you could resist, and many ways you could defend yourself. And the way that both Israel and Palestine have done that is not a legitimate way, in my opinion. So we could acknowledge that this is not a legitimate or beneficial way to respond, yet to recognize that is yet the likely response that will happen, right? Like, it could have been predictable that if Palestinians don't get their rights, violence that will result in violence, and it could have been predicted that October 7th, Israel's response to October 7th would be the destruction of Gaza, right? So it could be predicted and expected. That's not the same as justifying it and agreeing that is a legitimate way to respond. It requires nuance, which many people are not great at nuance, it's a struggle.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of issue that comes up in different ethical discourses anyway. Like when you talk about like, anything systemic that results in violence, you get this sort of problem where, how do you separate the predictability of the violence from the justification of it? And people go each way on that. But like if your actions are going to result in someone responding violently, you are responsible for carrying through with that. You got to own that a little bit. But then on the other hand, like, does that justify it? Not necessarily, So
exactly.
Yeah,
we could use like a very basic example. There's some people that, and this is actually a way to determine cultural differences, right? Like the concept of a yo mama joke in Western society is legit. Like you could joke about your friends' moms amongst friends. If you do that with the Middle Eastern, that's violence. If you make a joke about someone's family, even if it's a joke, violence is the response. So one can say violence is not a legitimate response to a yo mama joke, which is true, but it's to be expected, right? So I think that's just a clear-cut example of what we're describing here.
Yeah. And, you could think of other examples like that, that's get into gray water, like, dressing provocatively if you're female. Should that lead to harassment? No, it shouldn't lead to harassment, but some people argue that you're doing something stupid if you dress provocatively. I don't even make that argument. I'm just saying these are when you get this kind of.
I'd say that it's important for us to grapple with reality for what it is. So, if there's, let's say a woman wants to walk through a dangerous neighborhood dressed a certain way, that's her right to do. And if somebody assaults her, it's their fault. But that doesn't absolve her of responsibility to take precaution to care for herself. We need to accept reality for it is. The reality is, if you walk through certain neighborhoods dressed a certain way, the chance of you being assaulted is significantly higher. So you could die on the hill that it's the man's responsibility, which it is, but that doesn't change the reality of the situation that some men are likely going to engage in sexual assault. So it's not about victim blaming. It's really just grappling with reality.
Right. But the features of the ethical dilemma are the same as like what you get with Hamas and the IDF, or, these different scenarios where that kind of question crops up of responsibility. And ultimately, like, when you want to change that situation, instead of just respond to it, what you're looking at changing is a bigger system. You got to get away from like the individual for a moment and look at some of the bigger forces at play. Which I don't want to get started down that road of where that's making my head go. So I do want to give you the chance to sort of talk about what you've been focusing on lately and, direct people to some of your other content. I don't have a lot to say about it, but, I'm sure you could fill people in.
Yeah, sure. So, my primary focus for most of my adult life has been different entrepreneurial ventures. I've founded 3 companies. of which I'm still a partner of all three. None have failed yet, which I guess I'm beating the odds so far. But as you know, my time is limited, so I'm not active in all three. I play an advisory position in two, and as of a few months ago, I went all in on head-on.ai, which is really my primary focus now. When I have free time, I do content, which is Sulha, the YouTube channel, and it's to really align between head-on and Sulha. I feel like content very much plays head-on, so if I finally have an opportunity to connect my greatest passion of communication and peace building with an entrepreneurial venture, which I believe in and am passionate about. So what I would say to viewers, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel. Maybe you can put a link in the description. I've upped them out. I'm doing around 2 live streams a week. Hopefully I could do more in the future. And we're also looking for our early adopters for head-on.ai, which are currently, our community exists on Discord, where we're doing over 12 conversations every single week. So if anybody here is interested in being involved in the conversations, being one of our earliest adopters, helping us beta test the product in the AI, we'd love to have you. Unless you're not coming in good faith, and then you're not invited. But as long as you're down and engaging good faith, if you're coming, I'm coming with an open mind and good faith. If we'd love to have you join us.
Awesome. That was going to be a wrap-up question, but I actually thought you were going to talk about some of what you're doing when looking at the statistics and analyzing the casualties.
Oh yeah, I thought you didn't want to get into that, but I'm happy to.
I don't want to get into it, but I want you to be able to direct other people to check it out if they're interested.
Yeah, so something that's been consuming a fair bit of time when it comes to Israel has really trying to assess the extent of destruction in Gaza, the extent of war crimes, and analyzing the death toll. I put out an hour-long video breaking down every component of this, which you can find on the YouTube channel. But I guess on a high level, I think what we're Gaza is unprecedented. We're seeing an unprecedented level of war crimes from individual soldiers. We're seeing a disproportionate level of force used that's not comparable to any other conflict in the 21st century. And we're seeing a rate of children being killed unlike any other conflict in the 21st century, and a civilian to combat ratio higher than any other conflict in the 21st century. Now, this may come as a surprise to many because there are pro-war propagandists that are saying the complete opposite. You have people like John Spencer and Andrew Fox. These are people who have no skin in the game. They're essentially charlatans. They are building a career for themselves by denying an atrocity and engaging in atrocity denialism and pro-war propaganda. They are making claims that this is the best fought war in history, that the civilian to combatant ratio is unlike which we've seen in recent history. All of this, to put it lightly, is complete bullshit. I hope I could curse, but it is complete bullshit. Yep. I've challenged them to debates on many occasions. They refuse to engage with me in that way. They like to live in their isolated little echo chambers, make claims of which I've debunked on multiple occasions, of which they have never addressed. My estimate is that the civilian death toll in Gaza is minimum of 50,000 civilians to maximum of well over 100,000. My guess would be, if I were to need to guess the number, I'd say it's maybe around 60 to 70,000. People wonder how I have reached that conclusion when the Gaza Ministry of Health themselves are only reporting on 45,000 deaths. And many say that includes combatants as well. Israel says 20,000 combatants. So if you take Ministry of Health's word for it, you're only left with 20,000 civilians, meaning 1-to-1 civilian to combatant ratio. The problem with that is that people don't understand at all the methodology of the Ministry of Health and the verifiability of the data they release. So as a rule of thumb, especially in times of war, parties have an incentive to describe reality to fit their narrative. Neither side should be trusted without evidence being provided for their claims. Take it all with a grain of salt. When it comes to the claims the Ministry of Health makes, we actually have a very interesting situation because the Gaza Ministry of Health releases the names every few months. They release a list which includes the names and ID numbers of all those who have been killed or confirmed killed. That's an important clarification. Not killed, confirmed killed. These names and ID numbers all exist in the Palestinian Population Registry, which is controlled by Israel. Right? We have a very unprecedented situation where one party has access to the registry of the party it's warring with. So normally in war, a country can give a casualty count. They can inflate it or deflate it for whatever motivation they have, and it would be very hard to verify. In this instance, because Israel has access to the population registry, it's very limited the fabrication that the Ministry of Health can do had they wanted to. So we could actually use this data to give us a basis for the death toll. When we look at the data, so far there's been 45,000 names. I think actually it's 47,000 now, but the last list they released was in January or end of December, and that was 42,000 names. So that is a list that was made public where we have the name and ID number of everybody. When we look at it, we see that 58% are women and children. If we assume that civilian men are dying at the same rate as civilian women, we reach the number of 78% of this list being civilians. But we also have reason to believe that civilian men are dying at a higher rate than women because in every conflict, civilian men are killed at a higher rate because they're confused for being combatants or suspected of being combatants, and they're more likely to take risks like getting food, water, and aid. So the list that is released by the Ministry of Health is anywhere from 78% civilian all the way to nearly 100% civilian. Does that mean that let's say it's 100% civilians. Does that mean no combatants have been killed? No, because what we don't know is at what rate combatants are being added to the list. It's possible when a combatant is killed, they're not being brought to the hospital or they're not being reported as one of the deaths of the Ministry of Health. So there's no reason to assume that the 20,000 that Israel claims, and again, there's no, we got some balloons popping up. Sometimes when you do a certain code, it triggers something. So there's like a thumbs up one as well. That was weird. Okay, anyways. Israel makes the claim that they killed 20,000 combatants. There's no way to verify, but even if we take their word for it, based on looking at the demographics of the list the MOH releases, we would need to assume that the overwhelming majority of those combatants are not on the list. So we could conclude that anywhere from 78% to 100% of this list are civilians, but that list does not account for those not yet accounted for. There's people buried under rubble. There's people who have not been brought to hospitals. You know, when the hospitals are over capacity, and let's say someone is killed, you might just bury them in your backyard. Why bring them to the hospital? There's no purpose. So the confirmed deaths is an undercount currently, and it also doesn't account for indirect deaths, those who have been killed, those who have died from malnutrition or disease as a result of the collapse of the healthcare system in Gaza. The way we know that indirect deaths have not been added to the list is because indirect deaths are primarily very young children under the age of 1 and elderly. So if indirect deaths were being added, we should see an unusual spike of deaths among 0-year-olds and 70-plus-year-olds. We're not seeing those spikes. So we could conclude with a very high degree of certainty that indirect deaths have not yet been counted. So when we look at the ID numbers we have and the account that some amount have not yet been identified and indirect deaths have not yet been added, we could very easily reach 70,000 dead Gazans, if not more. So anybody claiming it's 20,000, anybody claiming the civilian to combatant ratio is 1-to-1, there's no basis for it. And I'll put this challenge publicly. If you want to debate me on this, reach out. Let's do it. I have had quite a few debates in my life, and it's generally not hard to find someone to debate. But that's when we're debating ideological things. This is just a matter of data and facts, and it's interesting. Well, maybe it's not interesting. This is the first topic I have not found someone to debate, and I think the reason is clear. Either you haven't done the research, comfortable debating. You do the research and you see that the argument I'm making is sound. But I will put that challenge out. If anybody wants to take me up on it, you're welcome to do it on my channel or on any other channel.
Can I just ask you one more thing that I just don't, I'm curious about? Um, Now that there's a ceasefire, does that mean journalists are going to be able to go in and maybe we could get some more clarity on what's been going on there, or is that still going to be restricted?
It's a great question. At some point, yes. I don't think so yet in phase one, right? Phase one should last around 30 days, I believe. I think by phase two, there should already be journalists coming in. And yeah, it's going to take time for the dust to settle, for us to know the true death toll, and to get a full account for the extent of war crimes that have been committed. And I also, maybe one more note on war crimes. I don't think Israel is uniquely bad or uniquely evil. Countries and people respond to incentives. Israel has a very unique set of incentives which they're responding to. So, and when we look at the unique set of incentives and conditions, what we're seeing in Gaza makes sense. We have a relatively high degree of ethnic hate. We have a very high degree of anger after October 7th. The IDF is a low discipline military relative to like other, because right, it's voluntary, right? It's children,
Right.
18, 19, 20, so it's not a high discipline army. There is also a low degree of internal regulation. So because the IDF is needed for the security of Jews, it is a cherished military. We have a high level of reverence for the IDF, that we give them a kind of free pass when there's some abuse of power. So holding soldiers accountable for committing war crimes is very unpopular in Israeli society. There's a societal and political cost to holding soldiers accountable. This creates a system where you have an undisciplined army with a lot of anger, a fair bit of hate, and no internal regulation. That's a recipe for disaster. Now, take into account the fact that we also have pretty low amount of external regulation, the fact that the US will essentially support anything we do. We also don't pay for much of our weapons, right? A lot of the bombs we're dropping on Gaza, we don't pay for, Americans pay for. So your weapons, you're going to use them more liberally. So this is just a very unique set of conditions, which is essentially enabling Israel to engage in the way they're engaging. And Gaza's very tough fighting conditions. There's two options. Israel uses brute force and causes mass amount of death and destruction, or they take a much greater toll to their own. They sacrifice a lot of their soldiers. Those are at least the two options if the decision is to go into Gaza. I think there's many political and military solutions that don't involve going into Gaza. But if the decision is to go into Gaza, either we sacrifice our own or we sacrifice their own. Every military is going to prefer to save one of their own over 1,000 civilians, but that's why we need international law and accountability to protect civilians from warring nations who are going to value their own over the civilians of the other.
Well, at least that's the solution we thought we came to last century.
We're making some progress.
Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground here. I'm sure there's some people that didn't enjoy everything that was said, and whatever. That's how it goes. But I'm very happy to have had you on. I appreciate the work you're doing. There's a lot of other things you've done that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Maybe we will someday. And yeah, besides that, yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
What you're doing.
This was great.
Mm-hmm.